In 1993, Richard Ashcroft, singer of then underground band The Verve, said this: "History has a place for us. It may take us 3 albums, but we will be there." And 4 years later, The Verve released what would come to be their career-defining moment, their 3rd album, Urban Hymns. And today, I want to share with you guys the story of the making of that album. But the story of Urban Hymns is inextricably linked to the album that came before it, A Northern Soul, and everything that happened while making that record and afterwards. So, to tell this tale, we're going to have to wind the clock back to 1994. In Oasis, the 2 main personalities around which the band had all its ups and downs were Liam Gallagher, the frontman, and Noel Gallagher, the lead guitarist. In The Verve, the main 2 personalities that dominated all the tensions within the band were frontman Richard Ashcroft and lead guitarist Nick McCabe. Towards the end of 1994, Richard Ashcroft split from his girlfriend, Sarah Carpenter, and he was left angry and unbalanced by the breakup. Nick McCabe was also in the process of splitting from his partner, and she was pregnant at the time. And so, going into the recording of their 2nd album, the 2 forces of nature in The Verve were already in a pretty dark place. In his book Star Sail, Sean Egan puts it this way: "The inner turmoil that McCabe was undergoing manifested itself in a feeling of suspicion to everyone around him. He was building up a huge dose of paranoia. He thought everyone was against him and no amount of praise registered. The signs were not good as work began on their 2nd album." Having already gigged together for some years and being from the same part of the country, Oasis and The Verve were always pretty close as bands. And so, when Noel Gallagher recommended his producer, Owen Morris, to Richard Ashcroft for The Verve's 2nd album, it sounded like a good idea. The Verve were impressed by Definitely Maybe's remarkable commercial success. Oasis had turned from the bunch of unknowns at the bottom of The Verve's 3-band bill to become a group whose album shifted 150,000 units in 3 days, giving them an immediate number 1 and becoming the fastest-selling debut album of all time. In other words, Oasis were now easily bigger than The Verve and enjoying the mainstream success that Ashcroft and co. dreamt of themselves. Moreover, Owen Morris's personality chimed with The Verve's approach to life. He was young and just as much inclined to the rock and roll lifestyle as them. No doubt band and producer thought this would lead to a harmonious recording process. They were both completely wrong. So, The Verve began recording their 2nd album, A Northern Soul, with producer Owen Morris at the no longer existent Loco Studios in Wales. This is the same studio in which Oasis would go on to record Some Might Say. The Verve and Owen Morris recorded together at Loco for a little under 4 months, and for the first 3 weeks, everyone seemed to be happy. In his book on The Verve, Richard Bowes says, "The first few weeks of the sessions were productive, with Nick McCabe going on to say, 'The first 3 weeks were the best 3 weeks of my life because we were just enjoying making music and not thinking about it.'" Trevor Baker adds, "The way they made the record was highly unorthodox. They created a kind of club vibe in the studio, listening to music all the time, taking ecstasy and just banging out tunes when inspiration struck them. It was just like doing a gig," bassist Simon Jones said. "We didn't have to worry about anything but getting off our heads and playing music." The euphoric, successful first 3 weeks of recording at Loco were at least partly fueled by large quantities of ecstasy. They weren't far from Newport, which Nick McCabe describes as the drug capital of Wales. And some reports suggest that they and Owen Morris took E every day for the first 3 weeks. After the high, though, there was the inevitable come down. And so, after 3 weeks of non-stop intense drug taking, as you would expect, the madness started to take hold. And from that point on, the Northern Soul album sessions began to devolve into absolute chaos. This is how those sessions appeared to the Verve's then manager, John Best. He says, "I remember going to Loco, and Richard, who didn't have a driving licence, had been driving a car round and round on the lawn, and he'd gone up on the curb and taken the tyre off the wheel hub, so there were big gouge marks where he was driving the car without a tyre on the wheel. When I went to the playback to hear what they'd been doing, I walked into this mayhem. The music was ear-splittingly loud, almost on the verge of pain, and Owen Morris got on this chair and walked onto the sound desk with all these delicate little dials, and he was standing on it with a vodka and tonic in his hand, and he chucked it across the room at the studio glass. That was $1.50 worth of glass we had to pay for." John Best also added, "It was like walking into a raging party with a lunatic edge to it." Ashcroft later remarked, "If we recorded every album like this one, we'd be dead." The Verve would play the same song over and over for hours on end. Ashcroft once went AWOL for 5 days. The group seriously considered wrecking a tape machine to the value of £100,000 in order to create a dramatic closing sound for the album. On one occasion, the band turned up to find that entry to the studio was barred to them. A studio employee was refusing to let them in because he was frightened of what they might do. According to an interview with Q magazine, Richard Ashcroft drove himself into psychosis through all the drug use and began hallucinating Syd Barrett from Pink Floyd there in the studio with him while he was lying in a sleeping bag. He also said he started hallucinating demons. But as most of the band and the producer began to vanish down the rabbit hole, Nick McCabe didn't really join in. He began to withdraw away from the band and into himself because he couldn't really cope with all the insanity. Manager John Best said, "Nick was introspective. Richard was the ringleader, but Nick was aware that he was more delicate. He didn't have the robust constitution of the others. He was given to dark thoughts. He avoided intense dope-smoking sessions or getting absolutely wankered. By the time I got to Loco, they were almost on different clocks. Richard and the rest of the band would want to get up about 2 in the afternoon and then start recording after dinner at about 6 p.m. and then go to bed at 6 the next morning. Nick had a child, so he wanted to work from about 10 in the morning till about 10 at night." Nick McCabe himself said, "It all went nuts. Richard and Owen were shouting and smashing things up. At the end, it was horrible." Bassist Simon Jones adds, "Owen Morris was the catalyst. It was all too much. We sent Owen mad. He said he won't work with us again. In fact, he nearly quit near the end. We've not fallen out or anything. He just said, 'Sorry, I can't do that to myself again.'" In the Northern Soul box set notes, Nick McCabe said, "I don't like being told everything's all right when it's not." Nick McCabe began to actively fall out with the 2 main ringleaders of all the madness, Richard Ashcroft and Owen Morris, leading Owen to say this, "Nick is, without a shadow of a doubt, the most gifted musician I've ever worked with. I haven't a clue where his genius comes from, but at the same time, he's a complete and utter nightmare. He'll never play the same thing twice. Now, you can ask Noel Gallagher to play the same guitar line 100 times, and as long as there's a good reason for him doing it, he'll do it. But with Nick, you've got no chance." You get a sense of Nick's deteriorating mental state from an interview he gave with The Face, where he said this, "I was a total emotional wreck. It got to the point that all I had in common with the rest of them was the music. My home life was a disaster, and I didn't feel comfortable anywhere." The band realised eventually that they were only ever getting anything done on Wednesdays. They would take 3 days to build up to a peak and then spend the next 3 days coming down. When they weren't laying down tracks, they would listen to music, smoke weed, take ecstasy, and jam endlessly. As the cracks began to widen between Nick McCabe and everyone else in the band, Richard Ashcroft did something that perhaps widened them a little further. He brought a few new songs, one of which was a song called History, and he demoed them to the band without Nick. And when Nick eventually did hear the song, he chose not to play on it, an ominous development. In the box set liner notes to A Northern Soul, Nick says, "I had to take the editorial decision that it was better without me. I couldn't summon up the spirit, and I realised that the writing was on the wall. Richard wanted to work apart from me." The record label arranged for a huge string section to be recorded for the song History at Abbey Road Studios. Producer Owen Morris, sleeve designer Brian Cannon, and Oasis frontman Liam Gallagher joined the band to watch the strings being recorded, but Nick McCabe didn't go. The Verve released 3 singles from A Northern Soul. These were This Is Music, On Your Own, and finally History. And the front cover of the History single showed a sign in Times Square saying, "All farewells should be sudden." This cover was eerily appropriate because Nick McCabe was now behaving in a way that nobody else in the band could tolerate. For example, when asked about his thoughts on Oasis, who were soul brothers to the rest of the band, McCabe said, "I'm not into cliques because most bands are knobs." This general attitude was causing friction with his bandmates. And eventually, all the tensions in the band came to a head at their performance at Tea in the Park in August 1995. During the live dates they played over the summer, relationships in the band became increasingly strained. Part of the problem was just that Nick was so unhappy. Even after great gigs, he would still find something troubling him. That summer, the antipathy between Richard and Nick began to escalate, and after they played Tea in the Park on August the 5th, Richard stunned them all. He got on the bus afterwards and said, "That was the last Verve show. I'm leaving. I can't do this anymore." Miles Leonard from the record label said they probably played one of the best gigs they'd ever done, and Nick came off and said he didn't think it was any good, and it was the straw that broke the camel's back. Apparently, at the same gig, Richard Ashcroft also fell out with drummer Pete Salisbury and ended up throwing his cymbals around backstage in a rage. Ashcroft initially said he was breaking up the Verve, but it became apparent in the few months afterwards that what had actually happened was a stealth sacking of Nick McCabe. Ashcroft had decided that one of the musicians in the band was proving to be such a liability that he could see no option but to bring an end to the Verve's career. The identity of the band member felt to constitute such a liability was a shock to many. Nick McCabe, the sane one, the only one who preferred to work on the band's music to trashing hotel rooms. It was quickly decided by Ashcroft that whatever records he would make from now on, they would not bear the name The Verve. Yet, it rapidly became apparent that those records would feature Simon Jones on bass and Pete Salisbury on drums. In an interview with Vox in October 97, Nick admitted he was largely responsible for the split, saying, "I was being a miserable bastard basically. They got sick of my fucking sad face all the time. I just got paranoid about everything, so they sacked me. Well, no one was asked to leave, but that's how it felt at the time. Me and Richard don't always get on. We are polar opposites." And so, in late August 95, the news began to seep out that the Verve were no more. However, in the NME on November the 11th, Richard Ashcroft announced a new band which he described as similar to the Verve, only better, which of course included all the previous band members, but not Nick. Up in Wigan, Nick McCabe had gradually drifted into a state where he'd given up on ever becoming a professional musician again. His time was spent sitting around his home, playing with his daughter Ellie, trying to patch things up with Ellie's mother, and making the odd home recording. His depression deepened. The state he got into following his effective sacking was frightening to some. People he knew would say goodbye to him with comments like, "Whatever you do, just look after yourself." But it's when your friends try to have you put inside a mental institution for your own protection that you've really hit rock bottom. At Christmas 1996, McCabe's flatmate tried to have him sectioned. And so, the hunt for a new guitarist began. One of Ashcroft's chosen options for a replacement for McCabe was John Squire, the recently departed guitarist from the Stone Roses. Upon meeting Squire at a party, Ashcroft reportedly proposed the idea of joining his new band to the guitarist, who briefly accepted the offer, but soon withdrew as he had his own project in mind, a four-piece that would go on to become the Seahorses. Another prospective guitarist Ashcroft approached was ex-Suedester Bernard Butler. Butler readily agreed, being an admirer of the Verve, and has described the week he spent rehearsing with the band as producing absolutely amazing sounds. But Ashcroft realised Butler was too talented to be satisfied with merely being his sideman. He had his own songs to contribute. Ashcroft couldn't accept that, and the collaboration foundered. Eventually, a new guitarist called Simon Tong was brought in to replace McCabe, and the band all moved down south. Richard Ashcroft to Bath, and the rest of the band to London. While in Bath, Richard Ashcroft began writing and demoing new songs for what was to become his new project. Amongst the tracks he demoed were songs called Space and Time, Sonnet, and a promising one called Bittersweet Symphony. Many of the Verve tracks released on their first two albums were not sat down and composed as a songwriter might. They were born usually out of extended jam sessions. For this new project, however, Richard Ashcroft was sitting down and composing actual proper songs with a beginning, middle and end, rather than just coming up with tracks that were primarily groove-based. And interestingly, that's how he chose to debut many of the new tracks. He opened for Oasis at a gig in New York in the States, and while there, just him and an acoustic guitar, he debuted a selection of the best new songs from the upcoming project. The audience reception was fantastic, and he was encouraged he was moving in the right direction. Next, Ashcroft began recording the songs with his new band, which was basically the Verve with a new guitarist, Simon Tong. They recorded 32 tracks in all. The project by the as yet nameless new band was done under the name of Richard Ashcroft with the working title Urban Hymns. And interestingly, when the time came for the band to record the album properly, they made an odd choice. Despite all the chaos and insanity of the Northern Soul sessions, their second album, they chose to work with producer Owen Morris again. They went to Rockfield Studios in South Wales and began recording. According to sound engineer Nick Brine, who was there working at Rockfield at the time, the Verve actually recorded a full version of Urban Hymns there at Rockfield Studios with Owen Morris, but the whole thing ended up being scrapped because the inevitable truth was starting to dawn on Richard Ashcroft. Ashcroft had been brooding over Nick McCabe for several months now. His solo project was producing material at a rate and of a quality he'd never managed before. Compliments were raining down on all sides, yet Ashcroft could still tell there was a piece of the jigsaw missing. A very specific piece. There was no way that Nick McCabe could be invited back that would not involve some personal humiliation for Richard Ashcroft. For once, though, self-knowledge got the better of Ashcroft's ego, and in the end, he gave in. In an interview with the NME, Ashcroft said, "When you get the inner voice calling you, you can deny it for a while, but when it starts eating at your insides, you have to answer it. You have to heed its advice, because that's your instinct, and your instinct is the truth." Less than a fortnight after his flatmate had attempted to have him sectioned, Nick McCabe received a call from Richard Ashcroft on New Year's Day, 1997. Ashcroft made contact for the first time in 18 months and attempted to patch things up and invite Nick back into the band. McCabe admits that the previous year he was in a really fucking terrible state and that he wanted to kill Ashcroft on sight. But McCabe had now changed for the better because he had been down to the very bottom and gained a new ability to see things in perspective. He knew now that he hadn't been the victim of an injustice, saying, "I was really ruining it for everybody in the last year of being in the band." It was a realisation which stopped all the brooding over what others had supposedly done to him. In typically dramatic fashion, Richard Ashcroft told Nick that if he didn't rejoin the Verve, then he would quit music forever. In an interview with The Face, McCabe said, "Richard had to eat shit. I told him I ought to tell you to fuck off, but I'm really glad to hear from you." Nick, of course, accepted, returned to the fold, and the nameless band became the Verve once again. But following the chaos of the Northern Soul sessions, Nick was not willing to work with Owen Morris the Madman a second time, and so all the recordings that the band made at Rockfield Studios had to be scrapped, and the band started again with a new producer at Olympic Studios. Happily, replacement guitarist Simon Tong got on really well with Nick, and so he stayed in the band as well, and the Verve became a five-piece. Producer Chris Potter was brought on board, and because Nick also got along well with him, as opposed to the previous chaos with Owen Morris, the album sessions became very productive. They recorded at Olympic Studios for almost 9 months, and they completed the last song for the album, Neon Wilderness, at 5 a.m. on the morning of their final deadline. Urban Hymns was completed. The first single released from the album was the Verve's best-known song, Bittersweet Symphony. And the story of this song is an entire separate story in and of itself, which is told in full elsewhere on YouTube. So in this video, I'm only going to briefly skim the surface of what happened with that song. In short, the band were both tricked and robbed by a man many consider to be the worst scumbag ever to have existed in the rock and roll music business. An American convicted criminal by the name of Alan Klein. Bittersweet Symphony uses a very short orchestral sample from the Rolling Stones catalogue, which Alan Klein owned, and so the Verve contacted him and his company ANKCO to request clearance for the sample. In his book on Alan Klein, Fred Goodman tells it this way: Klein had an odd win practically fall into his lap, courtesy of the British rock band The Verve. When the manager of the British group called in early 1997 to say the band wanted to get publishing clearance for a sample, Klein was ultra protective. He didn't want to encourage people to use samples and then negotiate retroactively. But this was precisely what the Verve were trying to do. Even though the segment didn't sound a bit like the original Stones song, and the arranger who'd written the riff, David Whittaker, wasn't even listed as a composer, the record couldn't be released without the permission of Jagger and Richards' publisher, ABKCO Music. Alan Klein stated his proposed terms of a 50-50 split of the royalties, which, in fairness, was standard practice for sampled material. The band and the record company were relieved, and plans for the release recommenced until Klein got in touch later to clarify what he meant by 50-50. 50% for Jagger, 50% for Richards. By then, it was far too late to change anything. Klein realised EMI and the band were in a bind, and he was willing to make an exception to his rule and grant a licence if Ashcroft sold him his rights as lyricist and the company became the sole publisher of Bittersweet Symphony. The bargain was made. Richard Ashcroft was paid $1,000. The deal was as unsparing as any in Klein's career. He held all the cards, played them, and then raked in the pot. When music photographer Mick Rock happened to call Klein that day to see how he was, it was obvious to him that Alan was enjoying himself. "I was very bad today," he said. The album became a hit, and Bittersweet Symphony would prove extremely popular. Klein actively exploited the composition, licensing it to be used in commercials around the world for various products, including Nike shoes and Opel automobiles. To date, Bittersweet Symphony remains one of ABKCO's biggest earning compositions. For Klein, it was the chance to linger over one last kill. For Jagger and Richards, Bittersweet Symphony produced both a payday and a Grammy nomination for Song of the Year. Pretty good, considering they had nothing to do with it and it didn't sound a thing like what they'd actually written. And so, as a result of Alan Klein being, in my opinion, an absolute shithead, the band made no money whatsoever from their biggest single of all time. That is, until 2019, 10 years after Klein's death, when Jagger and Richards voluntarily signed over the rights to the song back to the Verve. So that's the bigger picture story of Bittersweet Symphony, but as I said, that kind of is a separate story. Let's go back to the completion of Urban Hymns. Bittersweet Symphony was the first single from that album, and it went straight in the UK at number 2, being the Verve's biggest single to date. But the next single to be released from the still unreleased album was The Drugs Don't Work, which was released on the 1st of September 97. And with this song, the Verve got their first number 1 in the UK. Their second came 4 weeks later with the release of the album. Urban Hymns was released on the 29th of September 1997 and went in at number 1, staying there for 12 weeks. It became the 19th best-selling album in British history, was rated Album of the Year by Melody Maker, won the Brit Award for Best British Album, won the Verve the Brit Award for Best British Group, secured Richard Ashcroft an Ivor Novello Award for Songwriter of the Year, and also went platinum in America. It had been a long and tortured path, particularly for the two men who really personified the tension and the sound of the Verve, Richard Ashcroft and Nick McCabe. But all the agony and the effort had paid off, and just as Richard Ashcroft had predicted in 1993, with their third album, the Verve secured their legacy and their place in British rock and roll history. And I'd like to leave you with this final quote from Richard Bowes. Urban Hymns is, like its lead single, one of those beautiful moments in life when everything clicks. Production, musical proficiency, songs and confidence all gel, but with an underlying sadness which, in Britain, was a real insight into the mood of the country in the immediate aftermath of Princess Diana's death. The good times hadn't been forgotten, but now they were tempered with sorrow, with everyone either having felt it or been exposed to it. And even now, more than 2 decades on, it still reveals something new on every listen.